Hi, this is Bill McCamley, and welcome to What the Bleep Does This Mean? A podcast where we try to take a fairly complicated thing happening in the public and describe it in 15 minutes or less, and hopefully language you can understand. And today's topic is measles and vaccines. So there is currently a measles outbreak in Texas. As of the time of this recording, there have been 146 cases, but when you listen to this, it could actually be more. It's very contagious. What we do know is that 20 people have been hospitalized and a child has died. Measles is a virus that infects the body and causes a ton of rashes and spots, plus fever. It can also cause your lungs and brain to swell, and since kids have small airways, it is super dangerous for them. Most of the hospitalized people now in Texas are small kids. The good thing is that we have vaccines for measles. And if you are vaccinated, the risk of getting it is super low. However, vaccines are super controversial right now. And all I hear from some people on shit like this is do your research. So let's dive into that. And by the way, thanks to my high school teacher, Ralph Schock, and my biology professors at New Mexico State, where I actually got a minor in biology, the fact that I remember all of this after 25 years is a testament to y'all. So, what are viruses like COVID, HIV, measles, or the flu? Well, our bodies are made up of these really small things called cells, and there are different ones for all of our body parts: bones, skin, blood, nerves, all that. But all of them have the same basic construction. There are pieces of machinery surrounded by a thing called a cell membrane, which holds that machinery in, including a term you may have heard of, DNA. DNA is the playbook that our cells use to replicate and keep the pieces of our body going. A virus is a super tiny small thing. It is smaller than cells, and it's really simple. It's just like a casing made of some proteins that hold either RNA or DNA. And the way it works is almost robotic. Since it's so small, it can't reproduce itself like our cells do. But when it gets into the body, viruses find our cells and connect to them along those membranes I was just talking about, and basically unlocking them like a key to a door. Then it injects its own playbook, that RNA or DNA, into the cells and uses that machinery to produce more of itself rather than the shit that we need, more skin, muscle, or whatever. It is literally a hijacking. Now, our bodies have evolved to fight these things through our immune systems. Remember how we have all those specialized cells? Well, some of them are called B cells. And after we're infected, they learn to recognize the hijacked ones making viruses, and they then pass that information on, transfer what that looks like, to another group of cells called T cells. These are hunters that find and kill the virus infected ones, stopping the virus and then letting us recover. This is why when you have the flu, you feel like shit for a while. A lot of regular cells have been hijacked, so they're not doing what you need them to do for your regular body stuff, and your body has to spend energy producing more of these B and T cells to fight off the infection. But when the virus cells are killed, you start feeling better. And a cool thing happens through all of this. Those B and T cells that recognize and kill those hijackers, they stick around. So if the same virus comes back into your body, they can move real fast and kill them. And a similar process happens for diseases caused by bacteria. Things like cholera, made famous in my generation by the Oregon Trail. It makes you shit yourself so much that sometimes you die. Meningitis, which makes your brain swell so much you can die. And typhoid, which makes you bleed internally, sometimes so bad that you can die. The problem is that viruses and bacteria change too. It's a process called mutation. And these diseases develop new coverings so that the B and C cells from before don't recognize them. And then we have to go through the process I just talked about all over again. So, what is a vaccine? Well, in sports, coaches watch hours and hours of film of the team they're going to play next so they can be ready for the opponent on game day. Think of a vaccine like that. If a scientist can figure out what the current mutation of the flu or COVID or measles is, they can produce what amounts to just the covering of the virus or bacteria or a really weakened version. When that gets injected into you, your B and T cells go to work, just like we described above. But there's no sickness killing your regular cells. So you may feel a little bad for a while because your body thinks you might be sick, but you get better real quick because you aren't. And then you have that defense mechanism already set up for when you may be exposed to the real thing. A vaccine is like your coach, preparing your team, your B and T cells, for the game. Now, neither coaches nor vaccines are perfect. If the other team comes up with something new or the disease mutates and tries something different, you can still lose, but you are prepared and the process works. A huge example of this actually comes from George Washington, the first president and dude on the quarter and dollar bill. So smallpox is a type of virus and it really sucks. If you get it, you develop a really high fever with a rash that scabs over. But then it's severe back pain, abdominal pain, vomiting, and diarrhea. And if it gets into your organs, hence all that back and stomach pain, it can overwhelm and kill you. During the Revolutionary War, there was a big outbreak of smallpox in 1775 in Boston, right when we were starting to fight our way out of the dictatorship that England was at the time. Well, it got into the army and stopped a planned attack that the US had on the British in Canada. Furthermore, Washington was actually having trouble recruiting people into the army because smallpox scared people so bad. But about 50 years earlier, some doctors in the US, the colonies at the time, started inoculating people for smallpox. They didn't have real vaccines yet, but what they did do is take some scabs from people that had started recovering from smallpox, made a small scratch on the person, and rubbed the scab into it. That scab had the smallpox virus, but it was weakened because the other person had started fighting it off already. So the new person did get a little sick, but it was milder and people recovered faster and then they were immune. It was a more primitive version of the coach watching film thing that we just talked about. Well, Washington, who was the general in charge of all the US troops, knew how bad this shit was, and in 1777 required all of his soldiers to go through this process. It was a risk because A, if the British knew what he was up to, they could have attacked while the dudes were recovering from their milder sickness. And B, some of his own generals didn't like it, they didn't trust it, and they didn't make their troops do it until they were forced to. But Washington described smallpox as a huge threat. In his own words, and I quote, more destructive than the sword. And he kept at it. So by the end of 1777, when all the inoculations were taking place, the Continental Army saw a huge surge in recruits, and it was one of the things that helped us win the war and become the United States. In 1796, a real vaccine was developed for smallpox in England. And in the late 1800s, this French dude named Louis Pasteur made the first lab-created vaccine. It was actually for cholera in chickens. He then developed a successful rabies one, and then the process became more common for other diseases. Probably the most famous one was for polio in the early 50s. Now, these diseases we have vaccines for, they suck. Polio gives you fever, fatigue, and it can actually paralyze all of your muscles, which can kill you if the muscles you use to breathe stop working. Mitch McConnell, the current senator from Kentucky, actually had polio when he was a kid, 2 years old, before the vaccine got going. But you may not have heard of polio because vaccines have pretty much eliminated it in the Western world. Let me repeat that. Vaccines work, not by magic or some weird experiment stuff, but by a fairly simple strategy that even a dumb retired politician like me can explain. And they have eliminated or reduced some of the worst diseases in the world. It is literally one of the most pro-life things people have ever done, creating vaccines. Which brings us back to now. Vaccines work on measles. For instance, in Clark County, Washington, when they had a measles outbreak in 2019, a few years ago, unvaccinated kids were asked to stay home from school for 3 weeks. Only 71 cases of measles were recorded and 0 kids died. Let me say that again. 0 kids died because the vaccinated kids that were in school didn't spread the disease. The unvaccinated kids didn't get it and people lived. And with the recent outbreak, measles from Texas hasn't really spread into New Mexico. The state that I live in now requires vaccination unless a doctor says not to. And even counties near Texas have high rates of vaccinated kids. So not much spread. Those kids in Texas that I talked about that are now in the hospital and unfortunately dying, not vaccinated. So it begs the question, why not? Critics of vaccination have existed as long as, well, vaccines. You've already heard about the generals in Washington's army who didn't like them, and movements include an actual anti-vaccination league in the 1800s, movements against vaccine for diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus, three other nasty bugs, in the 70s, and starting in the 90s, one against measles. So what are the arguments here? There seem to be two big ones, and the first one is probably pretty obvious. Vaccines work best when you get a large amount of the population to be immune from the disease. Then, whatever bug is out there doesn't have the ability to replicate, mutate, and then find new ways of making all of us sick. That's why there is such a push when something gets out there to get everybody vaccinated. It's called herd immunity, and it works. It's why the military requires vaccinations. Again, George Washington's legacy. But people in general, and Americans especially, don't like to be told what to do. And let's face it, getting something injected into your body that you know might not make you feel good voluntarily isn't going to be that popular. The second reason is skepticism about harm from vaccines themselves. For the measles one, there was one British doctor in the 90s who questioned whether the vaccine caused autism. Not saying that it did, but just saying that it could. Various media groups seized on this, and it spread out to all sorts of conspiracy theories, even though since then, every credible scientist out there found that it doesn't cause autism. But RFK Jr., a dude who doesn't like these things and is now our new Secretary of Health, went to Samoa to promote some of these conspiracy theories. A couple of kids there were actually killed, unfortunately, by improperly prepared vaccines in 2019, and people got scared. So RFK went out there and started spreading all these lies about how vaccines cause autism and all this other stuff. Again, this is not correct, but people heard him, didn't get their kids vaccinated, and then 83 people in Samoa, mostly little kids, died from the measles. They weren't vaccinated. So what can we do about all this stuff? First, get you and your kids vaccinated for common diseases like the flu and, yeah, measles. The process is safe. It works. It will keep you and your family protected from shit that is super bad. Also, push back on conspiracy theories. Do not let lies about vaccines go unchallenged. Tell people to do their actual research and let them know how this stuff works. Again, it's not magic. It's not evil. It's not people trying to put 5G into your body. It's not an attempt to control anybody. Also, it could be helpful to point out the cost of not getting vaccinated. And unfortunately, right now, that includes RFK Jr., again, the current Secretary of Health. He told the public this last week that measles outbreaks are not unusual. But that's not really correct. The last person who died of the measles in the continental United States before this Texas kid was over 10 years ago. But this year, the number of cases has already passed 8 out of the last 15 years, and we're barely a quarter of the way through the year. As we see in Texas right now, the cost is real. A kid died. Kids are getting really sick and having to go to the hospital. And the places where this is spreading are where people are not getting their kids vaccinated as much in the past. And because of all the COVID issues that all of us probably know about real well, leaders are hesitant to publicly address this issue. There is even talk on social media about people having measles parties to intentionally get sick. So let's get the right information out there, because the only thing that happens when people aren't vaccinated is that diseases like this rip through communities, get a ton of folks sick, and kill many. And that is bad, bad news. Thank you for listening to this. Really, really appreciate your attention. If you have any questions or comments on these or any other issues, please feel free to comment on the social media sites where you find this at, or give me an email at whatthebleepdoesthismean@gmail.com. That's whatthebleepdoesthismean@gmail.com. Again, this is Bill McCamley. Thank you all for listening, and hope everyone has a great day, great week, and good luck out there.